everybody. This is Jacob Campbell from Leijiverse, facebook.com/Leijiverse. We are the only English-speaking Leiji Matsumoto dedicated community out there as far as I know. And what we've been doing is dedicating a lot of time to interviewing, speaking with people who are heavily involved with the Leijiverse, either in the fan community or professionally. And today we have a fantastic guest, somebody that's dedicated so much of their life to documenting specifically Space Battleship Yamato and Star Blazers on the web archive CosmoDNA, which can be found on ourstarblazers.com. He's also a contributor to the new book, Leiji Matsumoto, Essays on Manga and Anime Legend, a fantastic book. Tim Eldred, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Great.
Oh, you already hit us with it. Okay. I usually ask for a salute of some sort at the end, and you gave me the contextual one because I usually ask for the Harlock salute. So thank you for being ahead of the game there. Today, I really want to dive into what you do personally and really get more in depth about what you know about Leiji Matsumoto. So let's just start out with a very basic question. Who are you and what do you do for a living? How do you contribute to Leijiverse?
Well, let's see. My name is Tim Eldred, and I've been a comics and animation fan my entire life. And professionally, I do pretty much the same thing. I've been writing and drawing comic books since the late 80s, and I've been an animation director since the late 90s. These days, I'm working for Marvel Animation Studio. I have been there since 2012, working on various iterations of Spider-Man and the Avengers. Under the guise of my secret identity, I make webcomics. My current webcomic project is a science fiction story called Pittsburgh. That's Pitsberg.
Whoa. You know I'm in Slippery Rock, but I just got done spending a decade in, for real, Pittsburgh.
All right. Well, this one is spelled differently.
Yeah, it is. I'm curious to hear the difference.
That is the difference, the spelling.
So it's still the air quality. How is it in your story?
Well, the story takes place in outer space. So the air quality is whatever tank is on your body at any given time.
Is null. Yeah. Okay.
That's what I occupy a lot of my time with. And then whatever is left over goes to CosmoDNA, which is the Space Battleship Yamato website you mentioned. The URL is ourstarblazers.com. I've been doing it since 2002, almost the number that I'm wearing here on my shirt.
200 years ago, a couple centuries.
And that's ongoing and will probably be ongoing as long as I can spell words and type letters.
Well, you seem pretty active, so generally that helps in that department.
Yeah. I've been a part of anime fandom since, I would say, the mid-'80s when I first started collecting anime and got connected to other fans.
Yeah, what introduced you to anime?
Well, the very first anime I ever saw was Speed Racer back in the mid-'70s, but I was unaware that it was Japanese at the time.
Okay.
And it was only later that I realized, wait a minute, that was my introduction to anime.
Mm-hmm.
And it was fantastic. It was 10 times better than everything else on TV at the time. The anime that really grabbed me was Star Blazers. And that was the first one that I knew as I was watching that I was seeing something from a different country. And it was reinforced right there in the end credits. It said, originally created in Japan. And that got my attention because that made it different from everything else that I was watching. It was on TV every day after school. And it was a serial as opposed to an episodic series, which meant that every episode fed into the next one. And that introduced me to the concept of long-form animated storytelling, which is something I had never seen before. But it made sense to me, and it was essentially what I wanted to do. As I became more and more entranced by it, it activated the spirit in me to go out and try and make something of that nature.
As it did for many of us, yes.
Yeah. At the time, the only means that were directly at hand for me were comic books because I could write and draw on paper just for my own entertainment. And so I did that for many, many years, eventually getting a professional career out of it. That led into an animation career. And that's what took off, and that's where I am today. So watching Star Blazers made me want to become a storyteller. And it was equal parts comics and animation. And I grew up to do both. So that's where I landed.
When did you end up seeing the Yamato manga?
Well, Star Blazers was all I could find for several years. It first went on the air in 1979 and continued cycling for 2 or 3 years in syndication. And by the end of it, I would say 1982 is when I first met somebody else who was an even bigger fan of it than I was.
Wow.
And had also been exposed to some of the original material from Japan. His name was Steve Harrison. And he introduced me to the larger Yamato world, which consisted of movies I hadn't seen yet, and books that I was unaware of, and comic books, manga that sort of wove in and out of all that. Yamato was also exceptional for its time in that it did not start out as a manga. It was conceived as an anime, which was kind of unusual for the early 70s. The model before that was you publish a manga, it becomes successful, and that leads to a TV spinoff, which is why it earned the title TV manga. Throughout all of the 60s and a good part of the 70s, that's what it was called. Yamato was one of the first to start out as anime with no prior exposure in the manga world. And so a new word was needed, and the sort of inside baseball word for cartoons in Japan was anime. That was the professional jargon, or the industry jargon, I should say. And then gradually that became the handle for everything, because Yamato sparked a whole new generation of cartoons that were also not based on manga, and they had to have a different name. TV manga just wasn't going to do it anymore.
Yeah. Too many syllables. Got to cut one off.
That's right.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you said there that Yamato introduced you to long form, it's still TV episodes, but still a long overarching story that wasn't so neatly packaged. And I think what a better writer to do that than Leiji Matsumoto, who pretty much his expertise, in my opinion, when it comes to his storytelling abilities, is introducing children to advanced concepts. And Yamato very specifically does that. Harlock does that, a lot of environmental issues. So there's a lot of depth there. I mean, how do you feel about Leiji Matsumoto as a storyteller?
Well, I do need to correct you on one point, and that is that he did not actually write Yamato. That was very much a group effort.
It absolutely was. And I want to clarify what I was trying to say there. He did block out much of the story beats. And he was very, I mean, on your own website, I've read interviews with him stating about how he sort of led the story of Yamato, and the way he made plot points work is ingrained in pretty much everything that he's done. I mean, am I too far off base in saying that?
No, that's correct. If you go to the website and you have 2 or 3 weeks to kill, you can read all of the material that was ever published on the genesis of the series. So you can see the earlier iterations before Matsumoto came along. When he stepped in, he basically rewrote the plot line and brought it, I would say, 75% of the way along to what we see on TV. But it still took a lot of other people working together to flesh that out. There were several concepts he came up with that did not make it all the way to the finish line. such as the inclusion of Captain Harlock. But you are also correct in that his mode of storytelling lent itself very well to long form. In fact, it was sort of defined that way because he started many stories with no intention, or at least no solid plan about how to end them. And so if that's your approach, then everything you do by definition becomes long form because it's not intended to end. But that's not all there is to it. There is also the concept of an overarching plot that evolves your world and your characters together. And he's certainly very, very good at that. The only thing I think he was not very good at was coming up with an ending to his stories, because so many of them are still sort of suspended in midair, even now. So for him, it was never about the destination. It was always about the journey.
Yes.
Galaxy Express is a perfect example of that.
A never-ending journey right there in the song.
Yeah, the destination is secondary to the journey. And that story, in all its different iterations, is about the journey. Even when they tried to bring it to an end in the first movie and then the second one, it was still not a conclusive ending. There were still places to go. And
the Galaxy Express movie is one of the very few Leijiverse movies that actually has a legitimate sequel to it, which is interesting to note there. I mean, most Leijiverse series are not sequential. I don't know if he's not great at ending stories, because I know I've definitely been moved by the ending of some of a series like SSX in particular, and Yamato, of course.
But then you have to remember, though, none of the animated versions of his stories were entirely under his control.
That's true.
And so there were other factors at work there, like other writers, the animation directors, the supervising director of the series. The network commitment itself was a requirement for an ending. You know, if you only get an order to make 22 episodes like they did with SSX.
Actually, now I have to correct you. It was commissioned for 40 plus episodes, but because of it being sort of sci-fantasy where Gundam was taking off, kids were being more of a hard science fiction type of a story, they had to cut it in half.
Yep, not surprising. But you have to remember that anything other than manga is always going to involve other creative people. And whereas Matsumoto himself may have veto power in that environment, there are still other factors that come into play. It sort of becomes difficult to define what is pure Leiji Matsumoto. And for that, I think you have to go to the manga. But then even at that level, there are other contributors.
Lots of apprenticeship.
Yeah, whenever you come into the world as a manga artist, you're a solo act for a while. But then as you get more popular and the demand for your work goes up, you have to produce faster, and then you've got to bring in other people. And now you've got other contributors to your work. Now, granted, in the manga world, he would have complete veto power over everything that happens because he's the god, and, you know, his word is law.
Well, I'm sure he was putting up the money. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, I think, in a lot of cases.
Yeah. But then there are still other people who do contribute. So it's important just to keep all that in mind and not allow partial knowledge of who and what Leiji Matsumoto is to define him. There's always going to be a gray area. There's always going to be more that we don't know.
Yeah, and another point on, not ending stories, I mean, that's sort of his entire ethos. And you see it in the far majority of at least his sci-fi work is the sort of Toki no wa, the ring of time, the endlessness, the ability to go backwards and forwards in time, and just playing with that in general had a very strong impact on Yamato completely. How do you feel about his interpretation of time?
And yet,
Okay.
Many times in interviews, both in print and on video over the past 2 decades, he has said over and over he intends to bring it all together into one final conclusive story.
And he also wants to live forever.
Yep. That story has still never happened. It's sort of like George Lucas constantly saying he wants to go back to make independent films. You know, it's fun to say, and it sort of activates the imagination, but getting around to doing it is a completely different prospect. So
well,
it's part of his charm.
It's also very difficult when he's been sort of a rogue in the industry in general, you know, very independent. He lives under his flag of freedom. That's his ethos, even in his work. And with that freedom, as you learn in every Leijiverse anime, comes extreme responsibility. And, you know, his in many stories, basically with freedom comes death or danger. And in that danger, he's had some difficulties with publishing studios and, you know, most recently Zero Century getting put aside because of the Gainax problems that are happening. There was a live action Harlock film that I believe was crowdfunded that never came to fruition, and lots of things like that where working outside of the sort of tracked industry path has pros and cons.
Yeah, another of the cons is that you might find that competition has passed you by. You might find that the appetite for your particular style is not as great as it once was. Those things are hard realities to come to grip with, especially if you don't have a studio fronting for you and constantly addressing those things. If you choose the path of independence, you become more vulnerable to changing circumstances. But I don't think he ever walked into that blindly.
No, I think he's very deliberate, and, you know, as his family history, the lessons he learned from his father to walk his own path and make his own moral, ethical decisions, very important. And I also recently watched an interview with you and Helen McCarthy on MomoCon's channel, and you did speak on sort of the changing times and what is in and what is out. I mean, would you mind kind of just repeating what you said there?
Well, hopefully I won't repeat it word
paraphrase.
For word. What's most interesting to me is that in very recent years, he has begun to step back and allow other creators to come forward in the manga world and reinterpret his works. The newest manga that I've seen for Captain Harlock and Galaxy Express is very lively and, in my opinion, very competitive with other manga that we're seeing now. I mean, you can put that stuff up against anything else, and I think it's just as appealing and just as vital as anything that's being created specifically for today's audience. And so I'm glad that he had the wisdom to allow this form of evolution to take place. That sets him apart, I think, from Hayao Miyazaki, who seems like he's not creating any new opportunity for someone to be a Hayao Miyazaki.
Definitely not when he walks out on his own son's movies, you know, sort of.
Yeah. Well, and another important thing is, as an animation director myself, I realized early on that you have to train your people. You have to bring them up. You have to allow them to make mistakes and correct them. You have to be a guide to them. You can't just grab the work away from them and redraw it for the screen and not give them an opportunity to see an alternate path to what they did. And everything I've heard about Miyazaki, you know, I don't want to go off in too much of a tangent here, but everything I've heard about him is that rather than take the time to train up other people, he will just take their work away from them and redo it himself. And that might lead to a better Miyazaki movie, if that's your goal. But that also guarantees that when he disappears, there will be no more Miyazaki movies or anything close to them because he will not have trained a successor.
Yeah.
Whereas with Matsumoto, by bringing in new blood for his manga, he is guaranteeing that these concepts of his can continue after the point where he's no longer able to work on them himself. And so I think that's to be admired.
Absolutely. Talking about new school manga, it does look fantastic. Each artist, we interviewed Jerome Alquier not too long ago, and doing a fantastic job with the work, though part of me mourns the loss of the loose brush sort of manga approach that I don't know if we'll ever see again. I don't know if anybody will ever take that up and take the risk to defy what is now a hyper tight process. And you see it in anime, it's more of a necessity because you have character models, you have to rotate, squares and circle or spheres. But with manga, he had such a loose, flowing approach, so French inspired almost, sort of like manga nouveau. And I don't know if we'll ever see it again. I don't know if that will ever exist. And that's something that maybe is uniquely him. He never really trained anybody on that particular style. Maybe because it did go out of favor. I mean, how do you feel about the old Yamato comics?
Well, I would prefer to broaden the perspective on that. When you look at the manga that he was doing at the very beginning of his career, you wouldn't even have guessed that it's the Leiji Matsumoto we know.
Yes, much more inspired by, Tezuka and
exactly.
Things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. He saw that there was a market for Tezuka style art, and that's what he pushed himself to do. If you flip forward over a number of years in the 60s especially, you can see that evolve, and you can see his own quirks and his own styles starting to step in there until the early 70s when he arrived at what we know of as classic Matsumoto. And he stayed in that mode for at least 10 years. You start to see him deviate a little bit from that in the 80s. That was the time when he pulled back from a lot of the technical drawing and brought in assistants to do it for him. It was still under his direction, of course, but after a while, he would only do the characters, and then a while later, he would only do the main characters. When you compare that period to his work now, it's become much more impressionistic. And I sort of liken him to Pablo Picasso. Picasso went through almost every major art movement during his career, and he never settled on any single style forever. He always wanted to explore the next thing. And usually that involved taking more and more of the technique out and finding shortcuts and finding more impressionistic ways of representing what he had in his head.
Yeah, more expression over technicality.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where Matsumoto has arrived now. And you can see that in other artists who've been around a very long time as well. They loosen up. Part of that is biological because your joints loosen up and your control is not as tight as it was when you were younger. But there's also a kind of voice in your head that says, I've drawn this 7,000 times. If I have to do it exactly the same way again 7,001 times, it's going to drive me crazy and it's going to be boring. So I'm going to start to change it up. If you look at some of the artists who've worked in American comics over several decades, you can see that in them as well. They change, they evolve, they become other people. Matsumoto fits right into that category in the comics world. So I don't know that I'm leading to some grand conclusion here, but
it's Toki no wa. There's no end. Yeah, it's fun. I might have to coin the phrase Matsukaso now. Puns are in my head. That was bad. So let's talk more about your love for Yamato. What made it so special to you, and how did your obsession with it? Hopefully you don't take offense to me calling it an obsession, but you created a huge web archive, CosmoDNA. What made it special, and how did that drive you to create CosmoDNA?
Yeah, obsession is the only word for it. If anybody's been working on the same project for, what is it, 18 years now, it's gone past a hobby.
Yeah.
I feel like there's that I have to keep doing it. The reason it appealed to me so much when I first saw it is it goes back to what I said before about long form storytelling. From a very early age, I had been inventing stories in my head and wanting to take them somewhere. But the stories that I was seeing on TV were all frustrating to me in that they would constantly recycle themselves. And not all, but most were told episodically. So you could watch the episodes in any order. It would not build up to anything. There would be no accumulated knowledge at the end of it. And that seemed to me very unrealistic. And in the end, kind of a waste of time.
Definitely no character growth.
Yeah, why go out of your way to watch any Scooby-Doo episode if it's going to be exactly like any other Scooby-Doo episode?
Except there's a Harlem Globetrotters sometimes. There was some character development there. Didn't they learn to play basketball? I mean,
sure there was, and they played basketball in every episode afterward.
Oh God!
They got better and better, and they learned that everything.
And they won the championship. Yeah.
No, they lost the championship.
Oh.
They learned more from losing than from winning.
That's true.
So I was starving for an antidote to Scooby-Doo. The first thing that came along and gave me that antidote was a TV show called Land of the Lost. Do you remember that one?
I'm familiar. I'm also familiar with the remake, I believe, which is what I had in my childhood that aired on Nickelodeon. Or it was something very similar to it, at least. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. There
was a 90s remake that I sampled but didn't like.
I loved it, so it was right for me.
That's great. That's perfect.
Yeah.
The original came out in 1974, the same year Yamato debuted. It was a combination live action and stop motion show set in a land of dinosaurs. And it had mysteries that would unfold, and a mystery that you learned about in episode 4 came up again in episode 8, and the knowledge they gained from episode 4 applied to episode 8, and it kept building on itself and becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. It rewarded you for your attention span. And I found that that kind of story made more sense to me. That showed me the kind of writer I wanted to be. And then Yamato came along, and there it was right in front of me. 26 episodes in the first series, one giant story arc. You couldn't not miss an episode because each one built on the one before.
Well, the format kind of lends itself to obsession, right? I mean, there's almost an addictive quality of next week on, see how the story progresses. Yeah.
Sure. It encouraged addiction. That's a terrible way to put it, but
well, now we have Game of Thrones, so I mean, yeah.
And then the first series of Yamato would come to an end. All the characters would have grown because of their experiences. And you realize these are not the same people that we started with. They have grown, they have learned, they have evolved. And stories like that are much more meaningful than the ones that keep cycling over and over and over and over. That's a human compared to a machine. A machine is built to cycle. A human is built to grow. And so human stories are going to be much more engaging than machine stories. Then the second series of Star Blazers came on to replace the first one. And it jumped forward in time, and there are those people again, and they've grown some more while they were away. And they continue growing. You rejoin their lives, and you spend 26 more episodes with them, facing an even greater crisis than they did the first time. This is great stuff. that was exactly what I wanted to see, and that's what inspired me. A Japanese friend of mine had a great way of putting it. He said that story contains so much energy that you cannot help being infected by it when you're watching it. Mm-hmm. And that's what inspired entire generations in both Japan and America to maintain their fandom and to continue exploring it. You want to dig under the top layer to find what's underneath, and then you find there's layers under that, and under that, and under that, and then in short order, you are absorbing an entire genre or an entire industry, and it just gets more exciting the more you learn, and it gets more fun the more you share it with other people. And so that's what led me to want to become involved in the Yamato world and everything that was connected to it. So over time, I got several lucky breaks. One of my first was to join an effort that was underway at a company called Eternity Comics to work on a Captain Harlock comic book series. This series began about a year before I got involved, and the writer was a guy named Robert Gibson, and the artist was a guy named Ben Dunn. They were phasing out, or at least Ben was, and with the next one, this one right here, I took over as the artist. And so Suddenly I had a job drawing Captain Harlock comics.
And I've seen many of these and had no idea that your hand had touched likely many of the images I saw. Quick note, gotta be tough to be named Ben Dunn in a creative industry.
Yeah, that's not his original name.
Okay.
I believe he is Korean, and his family name was Dung, D-U-N-G.
Yeah, that's rougher in the States.
So if you had to choose one or the other. Yeah, so I drew Captain Harlock comics for quite a while. It culminated in a 4-issue series called The Machine People. Mm-hmm. Here's the final issue of that. So it was a couple of years. And by the end of it, my style had evolved quite a bit. So if you were to compare my first issue with my last one, you see a tremendous leap in quality. And then one of the next things that came along was Star Blazers. While I was working at Eternity Comics in their studio in Los Angeles, where I live, they got a letter from a company called Voyager Entertainment, based in New Jersey. And in their letter, they said, we are the worldwide rights holders to an animated series called Star Blazers, and we're contacting you to see if you have any interest in licensing this property as a comic book. I worked really hard to contain myself. I only rose about 6 feet off the floor when I read that, instead of hitting the ceiling. And I went right to the editor there and I said, you've got to get this. Star Blazers is magic. Star Blazers created a whole generation of anime fans. And they had benefited from that genesis because their most popular comic book at the time was Robotech.
Okay.
And you can draw a straight line between Star Blazers fandom and Robotech fandom. Came out from Eternity, were created at Eternity, and they were based on the Harmony Gold license.
Interesting.
They had no Japanese origin at all.
Oh, okay. Okay. Right. Well, fun note for Macross Robotech fans out there.
Yeah, in fact, I don't think there was... Well, there might have been a Macross manga, because back in the early 80s, there were a lot of weekly or monthly manga titles for kids that would adapt whatever was on TV at the time. I cannot remember right now if Macross was ever part of that. But in terms of a large comic book project, Robotech Comics existed in America before Macross manga existed in Japan.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
And the same is true of Southern Cross and Mosfita. All 3 of those shows were generated as anime first and other media second. The Robotech comics that came out from Eternity at the time were licensed from Harmony Gold and produced by Eternity. I did a few of them myself. I got involved for about a year and a half
Awesome.
on a Robotech comic that originated from Mospeada, and that was a lot of fun. But in the wake of receiving that letter from Voyager Entertainment, a lot of things happened. I took it to the editors at Malibu, and I pitched it with all my might, and they said, we're not really interested in this, because they were starting up a superhero line at the time, and they wanted to put all their energy into that. And it crashed and burned within 4 years, but I'm not bitter. And what that meant was that I could take the information from that letter and turn it around and use it in a different way. And so I approached Voyager directly. And this was after I moved on from Malibu. And I said, Malibu is not interested in a relationship with you, but I am. And I teamed up with a couple of friends who could also produce comics and take them all the way to the print phase. And I told them at Voyager, if you are interested in producing your own comic, we can package it for you. And that is what led to a series of Star Blazers comic books created by Americans for English readers.
Okay, wow. So was that the same circumstance with Harlock?
Harlock was licensed from a company called Coral Pictures.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that could happen is because there was a very short-lived video release.
Yes, abysmal.
A couple of episodes came out on VHS, and the name Coral Pictures was on the copyright. And so Malibu went to Coral and asked them if they had rights to license out to make a comic book. And Coral said, yes, we do. And then Malibu got those rights. And this was all under Ben Dunn's recommendation. Mm-hmm. So whereas I was unsuccessful getting them interested in Star Blazers, he was very successful getting them interested in Captain Harlock. Mm-hmm. And it sold really well for them. And it gave me a lot of opportunity to improve my craft as I drew Captain Harlock for a living.
Wow. Okay. So I never realized, because I saw those comic book covers and I thought, okay, those are Americanized covers that they wrapped around translated manga. But that is not the case, what you're saying. Okay. My ignorance is on display here for everybody, but if anybody else was confused, you see something with those covers on Amazon or eBay, those are original works. That's fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, and you can always tell by looking at the credits. Mm-hmm. If you don't see Leiji Matsumoto as the writer or artist, it was somebody else. Okay. That makes it pretty simple. Yeah. But here's a sort of funny punchline to that whole story. Coral Pictures turned out to be illegitimate. Mm. They were kind of a licensing pirate organization. Yeesh. And this was discovered late in the game when Toei Pictures, who was the licensor, or maybe it was, I can't remember if it was Toei or if it was Matsumoto's book publisher. One of them contacted Malibu and said, the rights to create what you're creating do not exist, and we want you to stop. Wow. And Malibu countered by saying, we licensed this from a company called Coral Pictures. Yeah, so it was discovered that Coral Pictures did not actually have the rights that they said they did. Mm-hmm. And so we had no choice but to admit defeat and close down the comic. But they did allow us to finish the story arc we were on. So at least we got to bring it to a conclusion.
That sounds extremely considerate. Yeah. I mean, that does not sound like a corporate decision. It sounds like somebody recognized. I almost imagine Matsumoto going, they're innocent. Let them wrap up what they were doing and we'll move on. Wow. Yeah.
So anyway, jumping forward again, we got to do several issues of the Star Blazers comic book. I have them all right here in my hand. These are very difficult to find now.
Okay. Can you go through those covers for us?
Yeah, it's been over 20 years since these were published. So
thank you.
We started with a number 0, This
Mm.
was a single issue adaptation of the first series.
Very, very Tokinawa of you to go zero. Very Leijiverse to go
Right,
zero.
right. Issue 1 did the same for the Comet Empire series.
Mm.
Issues 2 through 5, we did a 4-issue version of The New Voyage, which was the movie that followed series 2. Here's the concluding issue of that. And then we did an original story over 3 issues, actually 4.
Oh.
There was issue 6, there's issue 7, issue 8, and issue 9. And that was a bridge between the 2 movies, The New Voyage and Be Forever Yamato. So issue 9 was a prelude, which you can see there.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did issue 10, which was the kickoff of our Be Forever Yamato adaptation. And that turned out to be the last issue because the entire comic book world imploded back in, let's see, I believe this was 1994. No, 1997. There was a giant contraction, one of several, that took place over the 90s. Oh, wait a minute. I lied. There was an issue 11. This was our last one.
Okay.
So we got 2 issues into Be Forever. And then we had to shut it all down. The next issue after that was halfway into production at the time. So it was a difficult loss. You can see every single page of every single issue on CosmoDNA, by the way.
Oh, okay.
And you can see where we were when we had to stop, which was halfway through issue 11.
So head on over to rStarBlazers.com and check that out if you're curious.
Yep. That'll keep you busy for a while. If you're stuck for something to do in quarantine, that website is your best friend.
Absolutely. Everybody's binging right now, so
yeah. We parted with fond memories from Voyager Entertainment, and they continued doing as they were, selling VHS tapes for a few years. And then around 99, 2000, they got back in touch with me because they wanted to evolve from VHS onto DVD. And they needed somebody with my skills to produce DVDs for them. And so I got to enjoy that for a few years. Not just the 3 Star Blazers TV shows, but also the Yamato movies. They had been out for a long time, so I pulled together all of the reference I could find to create bonus features on those discs. And that's when I first started to realize how big the Yamato story really was, and how many untold stories there were about how it was made and how it was marketed and how the fans received it. And so by the end of my run on those DVDs, I had put together a lot of data that allowed me to create a documentary. It's out of print now, but you can still find it, probably on eBay somewhere. It's called The Making of an Anime Legend. And in the wake of that, I decided that, or rather Voyager decided that it was worth creating a website. And so it debuted under the name starblazers.com back in 2002. And it ran for 10 years. And they decided, well, we don't want to pursue this any longer. So, Tim, why don't you just take it away? And that's when it became ourstarblazers.com. And that's where everything got upgraded to make it, in my view, the quintessential fandom archive of an anime series. That's a tall claim, but I think I've earned it because of the time that I've put in, and also the depths that I've dug to, including lots of trips to Japan and lots of long-form translation projects, and also the fact that it's, I think, over 1,400 pages of content and still growing every month. And so I'm extremely proud of it. And many, many people have told me that It's enhanced their appreciation of Yamato, which is exactly what I set out to do. And the very best compliments came from Japanese fans who have seen it and told me, I wish it was in Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how many times have you looked at a Japanese thing and said, I wish this was in English?
Through all of your historian efforts, you know, you're really a scholar of Yamato. You've been somehow drawn to this new book that's coming out at the end of the year, if everything works out. Leiji Matsumoto, Essays on the Manga and Anime Legend, and on which you are accredited as a contributor.
Right.
How did you become involved in that project?
Well, I've been friends for many years with Helen McCarthy, and it originated with her. You may know her name from the books that she's published, including a big anime encyclopedia and a very large hardcover edition of an Osamu Tezuka art book. Mm-hmm. I believe it's called The Art of Osamu Tezuka.
Yeah, we just got to speak with her recently. That should be the interview that just came out before this one. So if you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's going to be good, but we'll finish watching this one first.
Yeah. Helen has been in communication with me over a long, long period of time. There was a point where she told me she wanted to her next project to be about Leiji Matsumoto, and of course I was a cheerleader for that right from the start. And then there was a point where she began contacting all of her writer friends who she knew to be Matsumoto fans and asked them to contribute chapters. And I was on that list. And so I wrote for her a chapter that touched on some of the things that I've already described to you, which I've learned over the course of research about all of the other people who helped to bring Matsumoto projects to anime, and some of the people who have assisted him on his manga, because it's I think it's very tempting just to see the name Leiji Matsumoto and think, oh, he's responsible for 100% of what I'm looking at, which is true conceptually, but not practically. Mm-hmm. And I found that the more I learned about the people he worked with and some of what they brought to the table, the more I appreciated his work as a guide and a teacher. Because what we end up with is still a Matsumoto project. And even if it's not purely his work, it is infused with his spirit. Mm-hmm. And it takes a very special skill set to impart that spirit to other people so that they interpret it properly. And those can be animators, they can be inkers, they can be the artist who comes in and just draws your buildings for you. Mm-hmm. They can be people writing music for your anime series. They can be people doing color design or background painting or whatever is needed. It's a very rare person who knows how to bring all that together and produce something that's true to its original intention. I think knowing more about that process and the people involved gives you a greater appreciation for the guy at the top. And so that's what my chapter is all about. Hopefully it inspires readers to seek out what those other artists did on their own. You know, anime is a long string of people weaving their lives in and out of each other, working together for a while, splitting apart, maybe coming back together on another project. Mm-hmm.
Such as him and Rintaro.
Sure. Rintaro has a very long and respectable history of filmmaking, not just the Matsumoto projects that he worked on.
Yes.
And there's a long, long list of very talented people who went on to do works of their own. And they're all worth following.
Yes.
So if this becomes a launching pad to help people find more of what they like, then, hey, it was my pleasure.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note how Leiji Matsumoto is such a leader, a guide. We're almost in sort of a post-philosophy world because things are so scientific. Even human behavior is so scientific. And I think it's refreshing to have somebody who kind of reeks of philosophy, you know, if you dive into his works, and sort of almost a spiritual take on things, but he's so grounded in science, and it makes up such a huge part of what he does to have this. I described it as, you know, sort of his left brain and right brain do a beautiful dance that you don't see in many human beings, period, let alone creativity. You know, people tend to lean one way or another. What's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is that science is an important element in his work, but the human heart and the human spirit are always more important. And that doesn't denigrate science in any way, because science is reality. But humans are always looking for different ways to get a grip on reality. And your experience plays a major role in how you perceive reality. And so I think his work is more about that than it is the scientific aspects. But the fact that science plays such an important role, I think, speaks well of him as a progressive thinker. But he's perfectly fine with throwing it away when emotion is supposed to take center stage.
Well, he does a great job of blending, you know, you said science is reality, but we have a very limited perception of reality. You know, we have our six senses and whatever tools we can create to read the world around us beyond that. And past that, Leiji Matsumoto really gets to interject his belief in heart and humanity and spirit. And perhaps that's the point at which science and human heart connect, is the part of science of which we don't fully comprehend. And I just love that. I think that's a beautiful way to see the world. It's something personally that I'd been feeling for some time before I stumbled on, you know, watching the first Galaxy Express movie, and you know, seeing that train in space, and Tetsuro, you know, noting the train and saying, this train is going to go into space, and Maytel's like, oh, it's not to your liking, you know, the work of all these scientists to make a field, a barrier around it. So, you know, she explains it off, and it sort of speaks to that beautiful blend that he has.
And that's a great way to put it. And it's also the more you know about Matsumoto himself, the more you can appreciate why he chooses certain iconography.
Such as the Yamato itself.
Well, I was thinking more about the train, in that one of the experiences that really made him who he is was his train ride from his hometown to Tokyo the first time. The train itself is a vehicle to the future. In his case, it was a vehicle to his own future, which he didn't know about yet. So on the other end of that train ride was a land of fantasy. And so you can see why he would choose a train as the vehicle for the boy in that story to go off and experience the world. In fact, he's written many times about that specific train ride and the thoughts that went through his mind as he was making that transition to his next phase of life. There was a point where he was out in the countryside and he could see lights on the ground and stars in the sky. And from his perspective, he was surrounded by stars. And he was in deep space. You know, normal people don't have visions like that. And normal people don't turn them into stories that they can share with the rest of the world.
I may have an argument with that, though, is that many people grow up and stop thinking like that. And I think there's just that, you know, the childlike wonder that never leaves certain artists and just bleeds throughout everything that they do. And he held on to that imaginative spirit to be able to reconceptualize the world like you were when the floor was lava when you were a little kid.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Didn't mean to derail you there, but
derail.
Gee, I didn't even notice that one. When you were contributing to this, I'm assuming you were doing some research, maybe additional research. But you've done research your whole life, and maybe even outside the context of the book we're discussing. I mean, what's the most interesting Matsumoto factoid that you have on hand for us?
The one that jumps to the head of my mind is that the fact that he did less work on Space Battleship Yamato than I originally thought, specifically in the area of character design. We look at, when we don't know any better, we look at a show like that. And because the character design is so distinctive, we assume it must be this Leiji Matsumoto guy whose name is all over it and who's this great respected artist. But it turns out that at the time, he had never worked in animation, and he didn't really know how to create a character model sheet that could be interpreted by animators. And so that job fell to the guy who was tapped as the supervising director of the show at the time, whose name was Nobuhiro Okaseko. And he was responsible for generating the character designs that the animators would eventually work with. And so he could imitate the Matsumoto style up to a certain point, but as you observed in your observation of the open brush technique, you can't use that when you're dealing with animation cells, and you need to close off all the lines because they're going to be filled with color, and then there's going to be a color background behind them. It's really
and you have to rotate things on screen. I mean, it's so much more difficult. You need to work in spheres and cubes.
Right, exactly. So there was a point where it looked like none of Matsumoto's character designs were going to get to the screen until he went into the producer, Nishizaki, and he complained, I'm putting so much of myself into the show. Can you at least let me design one character from start to finish? And that turned out to be Dr. Sato, who's this dumpy little sort of potato guy.
And an alcoholic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's also of note in... I'm sorry, go on. Yes, please go on.
No, I was just going to add that little dumpy potato-shaped guy was about as signature a Matsumoto character as you could get outside of Captain Harlock. Because we've seen that basic dumpy little character shape in all of the manga that really represents Matsumoto himself.
And that sort of face shape, even, up until the 90s, would leak through into other animes. I mean, you look at Goku as a child, and you look at Tetsuro in the original series, and you see a lot of similarities in their face. The way that the mouth sort of juts out and the nose kind of is on the junction point between the bottom circle and the top sort of square of the head. It's very, very iconic. And had a big impact. And it's also important to note, yes, he didn't do a lot of character design the whole way through. For Daft Punk, he's credited as being, a huge force in that series of videos. But in all actuality, from what I understand, he turned over a couple character designs and the studio just ran with it and sort of just... took it on and made it its own thing. But I guess that also has a testament to just, how little, I think maybe as he grew, he realized how little he had to touch something to make it distinct distinctly Matsumoto. Yeah,
to get specific, at least about the Daft Punk project, the character designer for that was a guy named Keisuke Masunaga. And he first appeared in the late 90s and early aughts as an interpreter of Matsumoto's manga style for anime. And he's done a lot of stuff. He did the Queen Emeraldus OVAs. He's the character designer on Galaxy Railways. He first came to light as the designer for the Yamato PlayStation games. And he's sort of become the go-to guy now. Anytime they think about moving a Matsumoto project to anime, he's the guy they call in first because he's an expert at capturing what makes that Matsumoto style special. So Keisuke Masunaga found ways of interpreting what was special about the Matsumoto manga style into anime, and even finding ways to preserve something like that open brush technique with thick and thin lines. And he's been very successful at it. But the other thing that we should always remember is that an entire generation of kids grew up reading Matsumoto comics and watching the first Matsumoto anime series like Yamato, Harlock, Galaxy Express. And even if they don't draw like Matsumoto now, they learned a lot of their technique by reading and watching what Matsumoto produced. And so his legacy is not just himself, it's an entire generation of creators who are all now adults and all taking the inspiration from their childhood and applying it to their work today. Another one that I can point to is Nobuteru Yuki, who's a character designer. He created all the character designs for the Yamato reboots, and he was a gigantic Matsumoto fan back in his day. He draws nothing like Matsumoto now, but he's had opportunities to interpret that style as well. There was a Galaxy Express, I think it was a pachinko game. He may have also contributed character designers to the Eternal Fantasy OVA.
Okay.
And so it's like everywhere you look, you're going to find somebody, if they're at a certain age or above, who brings that Matsumoto spark into what they're doing now. And it's not always readily identifiable, but you'll find it where you least expect it.
Can you take us through the process of writing an article for CosmoDNA and more specifically, your contributions to the new book?
Well, the contribution to the book is pretty simple to explain. I chose to make the topic of my essay the people who worked with Matsumoto and who interpreted his style. If I get too deep into it, I'll just end up reading the chapter to you. So.
Yeah. No, yeah, I want to focus more on just the process of, your A to B to C to Z. How did you begin the process of doing it, and what was the ending like?
Well, I began the process just by assuming that everybody else was going to talk about Matsumoto himself, either choosing a specific work or a specific time frame of his life, and probably approach it academically. But as far as I knew, I was the only writer on the project who was also an artist who had also drawn Matsumoto properties for comics. And so I thought I should rely on that experience to inform what I wrote, because that would make it unique. There was less chance of overlapping with the other writers that way. And so I just started pulling books off my shelf that I've collected over the years. Like I said before, the more you know about who he's worked with, the more you can seek out. And so I had plenty of art books by his collaborators. And it was just a matter of pulling books off the shelf and refreshing my memory of what I had seen on TV, or comparing one manga to another based on, when was this way made, when was that made, and seeing how they evolved. And so it was mostly a matter of finding the stuff that that I already knew how to talk about because of my research, and making the most of that. And Helen was very, very happy with it. And so hopefully everybody else will be too.
Yeah, I think so. And go pre-order the book on Amazon. We'll have some links in the description, of course.
And in terms of creating content for CosmoDNA, I've got a giant Yamato library here in my house, and I collect all the new stuff that comes out, including magazine articles wherever I can find them, both new and old. And so with every monthly update, I make an effort to put in brand new material that nobody's seen before. Usually that's whatever has happened over the last month in the regular news report, or some really eclectic thing from the distant past, from a magazine that maybe nobody knew to look for, like an old movie magazine that happened to have a Yamato article in it, or an interview with a director who is no longer with us, or in some cases, I'll go to the fan press and I'll find old doujinshis that were made back in the day when everything was new and fresh and wonderful. And I try to mix it up as much as I can so that there's a good balance of new and old material in there.
Yeah, I mean, that's no short order for a series that's about 4 decades old. So quite impressive that you've been able to consistently pump out something fresh all the time. I find myself posting every day for Leijiverse, just exasperated sometimes, like, what am I going to do today? And then I'll just post a simple thing about Harlock and it'll get way more engagement than anything I worked hard on, like digging up Lightspeed Esper or something like that. Why do you think Matsumoto's works as a whole never really took foothold in the States?
Timing is everything. Mm-hmm. There was a time when I think it would have been extremely popular. And that time was, I would say, the early 80s, because Star Blazers was riding high. And a lot of his best movies were made during that time. There was already a gigantic Matsumoto fandom in Japan, and there was a growing one in America. And if American fandom had been given something more to grab onto, like a translated manga, I think it would have created a foundation that still doesn't exist. Fortunately, we have fellow fans in Europe who have helped to build a foundation there. And their Matsumoto fandom is much wider and much healthier than ours.
Yes, I've spoken to, it's been mostly people, I don't think I've spoken with anybody in the States really on any of these interviews yet. Mm-hmm. So it's refreshing to speak with a fellow USA countryman over the topic, just because it's rare.
Yeah, and another part of that is because of the stuff that's been imported for a really long time, Matsumoto fandom began and ended with Yamato and Harlock. And there just wasn't a whole lot that we had access to beyond that. And
barely Harlock. I mean,
yeah,
more so the Galaxy Express movies. And what do we have for Harlock here that was of any quality? The dubs were atrocious. I mean, maybe I'll hit up Kenny Lauderdale. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, on YouTube, who does a lot of lost media stuff. And he just posted some clips from the dubs. Maybe I'll get to show them here, but they are hilarious.
Geronimo! Harlock, how did you get here? I jumped. Boo! Oh, don't hurt me.
It's the same person I chased this morning. Only it wasn't a person, Dad. I think it's a woman.
Tourists didn't visit the Statue of Liberty anymore. A ticket costs $5,000 to go up in the hand.
But it also speaks to Harlock's popularity, because that 2-minute clip has gotten 300,000 views in the last few weeks. So there is something here, but I don't even know how people know what Harlock is based on how low quality the stuff we got was.
Well, it's evolved in recent years. There's a lot more available now, thanks to imports. I'm just looking over at my Matsumoto video shelf from where I'm sitting, and just about everything I can remember exists on DVD in America. It may be out of print now, but it did come over. It did make the jump.
Yeah, and thankfully, I got into it with video on demand. So if it wasn't for Prime having Galaxy Express and Cosmo Warrior Zero, I would not be here. I would not be speaking with you. So so it is good that it's coming to be now. But yeah, I mean, timing is everything, like you were saying. I mean, you have anything else to expand on there?
Well, if we jump over to the manga side, I've had several conversations with a translator named Zach Davison, who worked on the manga that we've seen for Harlock and for Yamato. And he said that they did not have a lot of sales success from those. Very unfortunate. But again, if it had happened 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, I think a ready audience would have been there. But there just wasn't a mechanism for it to happen back then. And now a lot of that stuff looks very dated compared to what is considered manga by most Americans today. I hate to say it, but I think that window has probably closed. And, it's great for us to have this stuff, but if that window were still open, we would be getting more of it. I would really, really like to read Oidan Man, or Otoko Oidan, which Matsumoto himself says is his most representative manga story, the one he's most proud of and describes as his most personal. I would love to read that, but there doesn't seem to be any audience for it here.
Well, I think the issue, again, may be accessibility, and Otoko Oiden, I've schemed in my own brain, how do we get this here? And, print, I believe you're referring to the classic collection, which I have behind me, which may not have sold well. We have services like Comixology and other digital services that, these old IPs, you don't really need to milk them for the cash as much as you need to establish a fan base for the type of content that it is, and giving people more accessibility through a cheap subscription that allows you to view as many manga and comics as you want may be that pathway, because I'll tell you what, it's exactly what did it for me. Maybe we can touch on this because I keep bringing it up, and I believe you're more of a fan of the physical media, the ability to own things more permanently. You have a great collection, but maybe more of a resistance to on demand. I mean, based on what I just said, what would your response be?
Well, my response would be to point to the webcomic that I'm doing called Pittsburgh, PITSBERG.com. You're speaking my language, actually, because there's a point where I gave up on paper. Paper is a tyrant. Paper is a slave driver.
It's a commodity. I mean, it's tough to have your work tied to such a commodity.
Well, paper is a physical product, and anytime you commit to a physical product, you have to then take on a chain of expenses. You have to have it cut up. You have to have it printed. You have to have it shipped. You have to have it stored. You have to have it distributed. And that means whatever you put on that paper has to make back has to cover all of those expenses. Even before you reach that point, you've got editorial, and you've got people whose job it is to decide what goes on that paper. And so this cuts a lot of things out from the process. If somebody looks at an old Matsumoto manga and says, I can't sell enough of this to justify the cost of putting it on paper, that's going to be the end of it. Until you consider digital distribution. And I'm very happy to have it. If not for that, I couldn't do my webcomic. And what I've discovered by throwing away paper is that I could make that webcomic something that could not exist on paper. And at this point, I don't ever want to go back to paper because it's too limiting. Not just financially, but creatively. Environmentally.
I mean, there's all sorts of issues. And it's not just cutting down trees. I mean, there's a processing to paper that is chemical and So if you spend some time looking at Pittsburgh, you will see everything that I've learned about what you can do when you're no longer tied to paper. And I think it may only be a matter of time before we start to see some more eclectic manga titles make their way over in digital format. There's still going to be some expense involved in licensing, translation, design, packaging, lettering, that sort of thing. But if you cut paper out of it, that's going to take a gigantic weight off your shoulders. And it makes the logistics a lot easier.
I hope somebody is paying attention to that, because I want to read that manga.
I'm paying attention to you. Wink. I winked. That all being said, I mean, perhaps we're alluding to it. What does the future of Matsumoto's legacy look like? There's going to be a point where he can no longer draw. He will probably be able to write, or at least conceive stories, or give direction for a while after that. But the guy is not getting younger. He's over 80 now. I would say within a period of 10 years, we will probably have no more Leiji Matsumoto, and that's going to be a tragedy. But like I said before, he has taken the steps to
train his successors. So I think it's going to be a matter of someone coming forward and having an inspiration and knowing how to handle his characters and working with his estate and his publisher and carrying that torch into the future in different forms. I can't really think of anybody else who we can look to as an example other than maybe Stan Lee. Can you think of anyone?
George Lucas.
Well, he's still with us, and I keep
right, but he's no longer touching it at all.
No, I keep hearing rumors that he is. But
okay, interesting.
I don't think he's quite done yet. Yeah.
I mean, there were Tezuka works after his passing.
Right.
So, I mean, I can't imagine, after Akira Toriyama goes down, they're going to stop making Dragon Ball at this point because Super has been made a huge impression on people again. And so, I mean, yeah, there may not be a lot of examples, but again, that may be just a consequence of we've never seen something like this before. We didn't have, comic books in the 70s, manga in the 70s, anime, and so if you want to look at, maybe there are some examples in literature that we could look at as well. Of books and stories that continue to exist, and once they enter things like the public domain. I mean, Disney's a great example as well. There's still plenty of Disney things that are being made, not the same type, but Mickey Mouse might be public domain sooner or later if they don't lobby Congress to extend copyrights again. So
I don't know about that, but the world of Oz is wide open.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen plenty of new adventures there. I'm also reminded of Shotaro Ishinomori, the creator of Cyborg 009.
Mm-hmm.
009 stories are still being made by people who are carrying on for him.
Yeah, when they showed that anime on Cartoon Network, I was hooked. Something about old school anime style and manga has just always really hooked me because, we in the States, we grow up on Disney, and Tezuka, was so inspired by Disney and his style. And he knew, Astro Boy has the points on his head the same way that Mickey Mouse has ears. They're sort of structured the same way. So there's something just visceral about old school anime style that just speaks to the child in you. It's really amazing. And maybe that's the spirit that lets these things live on forever.
Well, when you're looking at hand-drawn pictures that are moving, there's magic there. You're seeing it with your own eyes. And the more sophisticated it gets, the more magical it gets. There's still going to be a desire to see that no matter how mechanized it becomes. No matter how good computer animation becomes, it's always going to be more interesting to see hand-drawn animation with life and energy moving in front of your eyes. There will always be an appetite for it.
What impact have fans had on Matsumoto, his work, his legacy? And I mean, he's been so good to the fans and so connected. He got in a car with somebody we interviewed who was just a fan to go to a trip to the museum in France not too long ago. I mean, how many legendary creators would have enough faith to hop in a car with a fan to go anywhere? I mean, do you find it exceptional? What's the impact? How would you describe it?
Well, there's stardom and then there's mega stardom. Mega stardom means you never have day-to-day contact with your fans or ordinary people, and you become very insulated and you lose touch, and you probably replace relationships with substances. But then there's a level of stardom below that, which is typified by people in smaller media. And I hate using the word smaller, but I'm just talking about economies at this point, where you do not put a lot at risk by interacting with regular people, and you are not such a commodity that people only treat you as a moneymaker. And I think someone like Matsumoto prefers being in that strata and becomes a richer person because of it.
You talk about, it sounds like you're talking about maybe like an actor, you know, where people identify your face. But with creators, you get to kind of hide behind characters a little bit, and you're maybe a little less accessible in the public. And then there's also the consideration that these fans are, it's so wholesome. I mean, maybe there's an exceptional quality to the fans that are more mature. Maybe they matured more just because of the type of content they were watching and relating to. They had to be a more mature type of person to be hyped into it. I'm not sure.
I think there's also a time factor in there because Matsumoto reached the peak of his popularity in the 70s and 80s. So anybody who tuned in at that time is now going to be an older fan in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, and thus more adult in general, more mature, more able to see him as a human being and not a superstar.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if I were in that position, I would have greater trust in my fans to behave responsibly.
And preserve you in something like a moving vehicle rather than do something reckless. With all that said, how would you describe Matsumoto's legacy?
I think it is a body of work that, as you said, finds the balance between science and heart. Finds a combination of the two that at once seems very dated and also very progressive. And I think as attitudes toward philosophy, science fiction evolve and cycle in the future, we're going to find ourselves coming back around to a lot of what Matsumoto wrote about. And I think his stories, if they are still accessible years from now, will continue finding new audiences because they are so grounded in the past and so reverent of the future at the same time that they become one. And everyone will always find something to appreciate in that mix.
Yeah, it's the Toki no wa concept and bringing everything together. And, you know, you did say the window may be closed, and we're entering a new sort of era. The world is more turbulent. You said this in your MomoCon interview, you know, attitudes are needing to change. We were in slice of life anime for a long time. People were more laid back, but now we have to be more active and see these battles playing out in front of us. And I think maybe that window is actually opening. And as Matsumoto said, time doesn't betray dreams. So I'm very hopeful for that. Fun question. Which Leijiverse character are you? I'm assuming it's something Yamato.
No, I'm Leiji.
Oh, okay. His cameo appearances?
Yeah, by that I refer to the images of Leiji himself, usually off to the side or in the background observing, taking notes.
He gets trampled on the Arcadia bridge as they leave in my Arcadia in my youth. Yeah. I believe. So sometimes you might be getting stepped on a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes. In fact, there's in the Cosmo Warriors Zero PlayStation game, one of the rooms that you stumble into in one of the game levels is Leiji Matsumoto's studio. He's just sitting there drawing manga. And we played with that a little bit too in the Captain Harlock comics, where we made him a crew member of the Arcadia.
Oh, cool.
And occasionally you just see him off in the corner drawing pictures. So rather than an active protagonist in one of his stories, I'm the guy hanging out in the background, observing and recording.
How has Leiji Matsumoto's work changed your life?
Well, starting from Yamato, as I said, it showed me the kind of storyteller I wanted to be. And the more of his stories I saw, the more I saw the pathway to become who I am now. And it wasn't a direct path. It involves a lot of timing and a lot of luck. You find what you're inspired by and you hold on to that and you stay true to it so that when those opportunities arise, you are in a position to take advantage of them. And that involves holding on to what made those things special to you in the first place. I think a lot of people decide to outgrow the stuff that they were inspired by as children because it either becomes very dated or embarrassing over time, or you find yourselves giving into the demands of the adult world and making less and less time for the childlike sense of wonder that we're all born with. In some cases, maybe it's warranted. You know, whenever I go back and look at some of the cartoons I used to watch when I was little, a lot of them are just junk. Yeah. And I can identify that now because as an animation director, I know what's junk and what isn't. And so there's always going to be a certain amount of garbage that you absorb and that can wash back out again. But there's always some treasure in there. I think it's incumbent upon you to identify what that treasure is, to develop the skill to separate it out from the rest, and then and hold on to that and make sure it remains special, and the things that it taught you become timeless. The things that I learned about the human spirit from looking at Matsumoto's stories are timeless, and they find themselves into my work in different ways. I don't draw like him. I don't really write like him, but I can think like him to a certain degree because I've absorbed so much of his thinking. And I think that makes me a better creator. That is, I think, the most important way he has changed my life. Secondary to that is I've had an opportunity to make a fair amount of income because I was lucky enough to get to work on Captain Harlock comics and Star Blazers comics and develop my relationship with the Yamato franchise through Voyager Entertainment. All of that contributed to the skill set that I have now and that is still paying off.
It sounds like you went through almost an apprenticeship, but maybe even more of a roguish one. I mean, he indirectly, was guiding you the whole time. And it goes back to what I said. He has to do so little to have such a huge impact. And you said it made you a better creator, but I have little doubt it made you a better person overall. And I've had such a fantastic time talking with you. You've been so kind to give me your time and so patient and so informative. So I want to thank you again for that. I want to make sure I mention again, Leiji Matsumoto, Essays on the Manga and Anime Legend is on pre-order now. Please go pick it up. Please recommend it to your local library, your local college, because this is going to be a fantastic historical English document to show us how important Matsumoto was. And again, your contribution is so important. Head over to ourstarblazers.com, read up all the good stuff on CosmoDNA, that web archive. You'll have quite a bit of time. You'll need quite a bit of time to get through it all, but along the way, there are some magnificent nuggets in there, and I'm extremely appreciative. Thank you again. Usually I sign off here asking for that Harlock salute. Like I said, you gave me the Star Blazers salute. So I think, yes, I'm gonna give that right back to you, sir. He can't see it, but you'll see it in post. And okay, yes, and a Harlock salute. We appreciate that. Thank you, Leijiverse, facebook.com/Leijiverse. Check us out. We post about the master every day. Thank you, and have a good one.
Go rum.
See you, everybody.